And so even though you may not see us in this exact format or grouping, we do plan to see you around at regional and county and even state events, focusing on teaching history and social science. So we'll look forward to building on this network and relationships that we've established in the last few years. Today, our focus is the Genocide Education Project, and we are really excited to be able to share this session with you. I know I'm going to learn a lot because this is not an area of strength for me, so I'll be learning from my colleagues. But we're really excited to be together today to share some learning with you and to also learn from you because you have experiences as well. And I always appreciate these opportunities as being times to learn with and from each other. The next slide, you'll see who we are. I'm Audrey Garza from Merced County Office of Ed. I'm part of the Region 7 CLIC team focused on content literacy inquiry and citizenship. Along with me, I'm going right to left this time since I'm the intro person. There's Wasim from Merced County as well, Gustine High School. We're glad that he's been a part of this journey. It's been just fabulous having his teacher perspective when we're in our learning together, and then also providing learning opportunities for fellow educators throughout the region. I love having his teacher perspective. In the middle is Justin. He's been our lead from Tulare County Office of Education the last couple years, and we really appreciate his leadership. He is detail-oriented and keeps us on track. So thank you, Justin, if I don't get a chance to say it later. Next up is Carrie Faria from Fresno County Superintendent of Schools. Got to remember that. We're glad that she's here. She's been a delight, and you're going to have a wonderful opportunity to hear from her and the others today. And then not with us in this session because of other commitments is Stephanie Bobman from Mariposa County. But we're really glad to have been able to be part of the CLIC project, learning with and from each other. Just a reminder, as we're going into today's focus on the Genocide Education Project, of those 4 shifts from the framework, focusing on content, of course. It's what we love, what we're passionate about. The inquiry and disciplinary thinking, digging deeper, wanting our students to become thinkers. We want them to be critical. We want them to push back and question what they're hearing, what they're seeing, what they're learning, so that they themselves can be active learners. Of course, citizenship and civic preparation. We want our students to be ready to take action, to make a difference. I often say this, and people might be tired of hearing it, but history is not just in the past, it's currently being made. And we want our students to recognize that they have a role in shaping today's history. And so we want them to be active participants in that. And then of course, literacy, which is threaded throughout all of our learning, and how important it is, and that special focus throughout the history frameworks on literacy, that we're all working together to build that among our students. So we're glad you're here today, and we're looking forward to learning with and from you. Carrie? Or no, sorry, I think it's Wasim.
Yeah, I'll be taking it. Thank you. There are a number of different ways in which we can attack the problem of genocide, but most, I think, really boil down to figuring out what's going on and how we can get that point across. And so the Armenian genocide in particular lends itself to being a vehicle to discuss some of these issues. It was the reason why the term genocide was created. The Armenian genocide, the term genocide hadn't been used in that way before those events. The acts that were committed during that time meet all of the definitions for the United Nations. As a matter of fact, that was one of the several factors that they considered when they were coming up with their guidelines and definitions. It was the single most significant series of human rights events during World War I. And I say events because you may wish to, as you're delving into the history, divide into the discrete different time frames. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. And quite frankly, it was the prototype for what genocide is in the modern era. The study specifically of the Armenian genocide, if we could go to the next slide, please. It helps to see that it's more than just about killing. There are lasting effects of genocide. So not to diminish the murders, not to diminish the deaths, but we need to make sure that we're also building an understanding of the long-term lasting effects, the continued hostilities, the legal, financial, and social repercussions throughout time. There's also the importance of combating denial and revisionist history, and the importance of promoting global citizenship. I think in today's world, we really can see that. I don't think I really have to make the point to that great a degree. And then finally, by looking at the lens of the 10 stages of genocide and looking specifically at the Armenian genocide, we can look at a lot of different facets to examine the complexity. You can look at the political, ethnic, religious, or social aspects, for example. All are on display when we're talking about the Armenian genocide. And then finally, the most important, I think, well, among the most important, and it's always important for all horrific events, is the aspect of commemoration. And by speaking the truth of the Armenian genocide, we are being witnesses to history. And ultimately, that is what, as historians, I think we want to teach our children to do. We want to teach our students to not just learn what the past was, to bring that forward into the present, as Audrey was making reference to. And if we can go to the next slide, please. I don't really need to explain the quote. I think that the quote, quite frankly, speaks for itself. Adolf Hitler was very mindful of the Armenian genocide, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Next slide. So the Armenian genocide fits the typical kind of stage classification, the 10 stages of genocide, which is a way of looking at how societies begin to move into and then fully embrace and cooperate in the process of genocide. It begins with classification, moves through symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and then finally denial. And we're going to look a little bit more at each one of those. I do want to caution you that, well, I probably don't need to caution you as people who are living in the world and aware of history, that sometimes there's blending of these categories, but especially when you are finding ways to connect your students with the curriculum, be mindful that they might fall into the pitfall of thinking that it has to sort of go in order. Well, if you see polarization 6, but you didn't see dehumanization 4, then it can't be on that continuum. It's a general pattern rather than a formula. So when you're sharing this, if you share this part of the information with your students, please make sure that they don't fall into that trap. Next slide, please. So when we get to classification, the first stage, it's really about us versus them. And it can be in any one of a variety of different ways. Nationality, ethnicity, race, and religion are very typical. In the more recent past, especially during the Cold War era, by class in terms of Marxism, and for a long swath of history in terms of politics. Whenever we have that classification, this is the group that is us, and that is the group that is them. It sets up that power struggle within society. Next slide. And you can see this playing out in a lot of different ways, the us versus them. In Rwanda, for example, the colonists, the Belgians who were coming in, would take physical measurements based on the nose size, the height of the nose, eye type, the number of cattle owned, and a number of other physical characteristics that they somehow deemed appropriate, they ranked and distinguished between the Tutsis and the Hutus. And that buildup, that classification created a power struggle between those two groups. You could see that play out in the event of the mid-1990s in the Rwanda genocide. Next slide, please. After you have created the categorization and the classification, the next stage is symbolization. And it's important to point out that this could be self-symbolization as well as others. So it could be a group uniform, like a swastika that was adopted by the fascists, the brown shirts in Nazi Germany, or it could be enforced symbolization of others, such as the yellow star for Jews, or in Cambodia, the scarf. The idea here is that you're moving the classification into a physical space, into a physical way. It could be specific articles of clothing, or it could be general styles of clothing. It could be the way that people spell their names, or the typical names that people choose. It could be the languages of expression. But it becomes a way to symbolize the people that you have previously classified. Next slide, please. Once you have made it easy to determine us versus them physically, the next stage is the actual discrimination, where you are engaged in having separate rules for who can vote or not vote, or how that happens, what jobs or travel you can do, what kind of perhaps what kind of documents that you need in order to hold a job, what kind of documents you need in order to travel for a job. And this segues into, if you can think of the apartheid system in South Africa, is a perfect example. And I'm trying to give you kind of a broad range so we can find many different hooks to connect this for our students. It would be a perfect example where Black Africans in South Africa were forced to carry paperwork when they were traveling through what had been, before colonization, had been their own country before the British, well, the Dutch, and then later the British colonized. That overt discrimination in the American South, the Jim Crow laws, I mean, there are many different ways in which you can look at that, and you can bring that in terms of the way that the laws, the customs, the rights and responsibilities in society are apportioned legally. Next slide. Once you have begun the process of discrimination, it becomes much easier to dehumanize, to perceive others as being somewhat less than human. This can be official in terms of a second class of citizenship, where it's official that you don't have the same rights. This gets into questions of guest worker rights status in many countries throughout the world. And that second class citizenship is just one example of how that could work in a sort of a formal mechanism. A lot of times there are informal mechanisms, competitions to parasites or insects or animals. You could see this flyer, the solution for Tutsi cockroaches, for example, and a picture of a machete. That dehumanization, I can't say that there are no human beings who would have responded positively if it was the solution for Tutsi fellow human beings for whom we disagree. But clearly the dehumanization aspect, the comparison to insects, if you want to point that out to children, they can see a lot of the beginnings of maybe some of their own behavior. Depending on how young they are, they might need some prompting. That name calling and dehumanization, referring to people by a specific gender or a specific body part, it's along those same lines. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean somebody's engaged in genocide. I don't want to make that point. I want to broaden these categories so that regardless of where we are, and I think we're more towards the upper spectrum, if I recall, in terms of grade levels. But even at lower grade levels, these discussions can be had in terms of good citizenship and why it's important that we hold our tongue and maybe don't use foul names at first if we're talking to really young children who need that sort of prompting. We might have older children who need that sort of prompting too. So we should always keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Once the process of dehumanization has begun, then the organization can begin, because it's no longer seen as extreme. It's no longer seen as something beyond the pale. And ultimately, genocide has to be a cooperative crime. It has to have multiple separate elements of society working together. And usually there will be a dominant or elite group in society that organizes, arms, and sometimes finances the killing. The elites sometimes plan directly. Sometimes it is indirect planning. In terms of Rwanda, they didn't have a formal structural final solution plan like during the Nazi Holocaust, but providing militia with machetes and training, you have a plan. It's not a formalized plan. It doesn't need to be organized, but you've organized resources, you've organized personnel, you've organized training for an apparent purpose. Okay, after we have organization, now we have official groups in the streets. Next slide, please. Now we have official groups, and we can start the polarization where extremists are going into the society and propaganda is really exploding. You have broadcast and print media. This is where you're starting to get much more in-depth laws that are forbidden any sort of interaction, specifically intermarriage, but that's one of the easier things to control through laws, but making sure that it becomes forbidden for groups to meet in outside of certain venues. And anybody who points out that, you know what, maybe this is too far, too extreme, maybe we have an issue, but maybe this isn't the way to handle it, they're intimidated, silenced, or assassinated. And again, without putting too fine a point on it, we can find a number of examples of polarization, which isn't necessarily indicative of genocide, but we can see how it is destructive of societies, and pointing out this step, pulling out this step in isolation. Maybe if your students are young, that you don't feel comfortable talking about genocide and answering those questions. Then certainly discussions about polarization and the importance of understanding multiple viewpoints and tolerating moderates and tolerating the middle, tolerating people with other points of view than yours, or definitely other skin tones. But we tend to think about it in those terms. We don't necessarily tend to think about it in terms of political polarization. And that's really important, because that's the next step before, or that's the step before the actual preparation. Next slide, please. And step 7 is the actual preparation, where you are stockpiling the military weaponry, you are building the training camps, the distribution of weapons is happening, you have, brevet militias popping up, you have hierarchical command control structures, and you're getting ready to begin. This is the lead up. It's often easier to identify in hindsight, because building up your military is something that many countries do. Stockpiling weapons is something that many countries do. But the idea is that this is combined with polarization and that organization aspect. So you're really building towards something, and that is stage number 8. Next slide, please. And stage number 8 is the persecution, and you are separating people, moving them out. You're not merely requiring them, to carry paperwork. You're moving them, perhaps to concentration camps, internment camps. You're separating them based on their ethnic identity, their religious identity, based on the language or the colors of the symbols that you have. I don't want to use the term branded, because in some cases it literally was branding, but that you have labeled or classified or categorized people with, and you are moving them into ghettos, you are moving them into tent evacuee refugee cities, and you're getting ready for the next to the final step. You're taking the property, you're taking what they own, stripping them down so that they only have their lives, in preparation for stage 9. Next slide, please. And stage 9 is the actual extermination phase. And I want to be very, very clear about something here. The picture is of Armenian children dying during the deportation marches. And those children are just as much they are just as much victims of genocide as if they had been shot with bullets. So not every genocide happens with bullets. It could be starvation, Zyklon B gas. There's lots of different methods. And I just want to be very, very clear because while by no means, I don't want to make the wrong statement. I'm not telling you that Turks didn't shoot Armenians. They absolutely did. But part of the major suffering were these massive refugee trains where people were forced to march, and if they couldn't keep up, they were lying down and they just died where they were essentially dropped. And these children, it's not that their parents didn't care for them. I doubt that their parents had made it that far. So I want to be clear that the method of extermination, the method of killing, the method of genocide, the method of erasure varies. It varies based on situation. I mean, in Rwanda, you saw machetes, and that's what the items were at hand. So we don't necessarily want to get too caught up in any particular method. The idea is that it's the execution, that it's the massive killings. Next slide. And we can see a couple of examples of that. Killing squads working with the armed forces and militia together, Nazi killing squads working with local militias. So you have official formal military and informal paramilitary forces working together, and they're carrying this out, whether it is with bullets, with machetes, with bombs, with gas, whether it's with forced march and denial of food, whether it's literally just keeping people locked up in a pen. The method of extermination, I need to take a minute because I'm getting worked up. The method of extermination, what it has in common is that when it gets to this phase, it's all hands are in. The organized forces are all working together. May not be the entirety of society. It may not be the entirety of the dominant or oppressive group, but it is formal and it is informal together, moving together, which sets the stage for the last piece of the puzzle, next slide, which is denial. And this occurs after the genocide, where nobody seems willing to talk about what happened. The perpetrators deny that it happened. The victims obviously have been slaughtered. They are the victims of the genocide. They are not numerous. They are not people who were in a position to have a lot of voice. And by continuing to allow that to happen, it increases the probability of future actions. I mean, don't take my word for it. I think Hitler's quote speaks for itself. I just can't stop coming back to that. And it's important to know that extension, that denial, that extension, it becomes something else. I doubt, I can't say 100%, but I doubt that there are any Turks who are alive today who were actively involved in terms of carrying out officially or unofficially the Armenian genocide. But there are generations of school children who have grown up with history books that say things that, quite frankly, there's no other way to say it, but that they are not true. If we can go to the next step, next slide, please. The idea here is that you are going to do anything under the sun. You can blame the victims. Well, yes, there were some Armenians who were killed because they were fighting on behalf of the enemy. They were fighting for the enemy, so we had to kill them. You deny that it happened. You minimize the evidence. Well, okay, so you found a mass grave. Well, maybe they had, it was the Spanish flu. It was about the same time. So, maybe it was something else. You say, well, it wasn't 1.5 million. I mean, maybe there were some soldiers who didn't know what they were doing and there were some minor deaths. You deny the intent. Look, we just needed to make sure that we were safe and we just wanted them to leave our borders. We didn't know that they would die because they had no food and had to walk hundreds of miles with all of their possessions stolen from them at the very beginning. I don't mean to be facetious, but I don't know how else I can make these claims from that point of view. So I do apologize. It rubs me the wrong way a little bit too. You blame the circumstances of the war. You point out that, hey, you know, there's a lot of confusion and people are fighting and shooting and it's not always obvious who's who. You make the claim repeatedly that, look, we're trying to make amends, and just bringing up this term genocide is just going to harm the process. It's going to make people upset and we can't move forward. Don't you want to move forward and be peaceful? And especially this one rings true with Turkey up until recently. The idea and the claim that genocide is going to harm our strategic interests because Turkey's on our side in NATO in the Cold War. And those kinds of statements have been made and they will continue to be made. It isn't always the story that denial wins the day. If you have been following the news, next slide, please. If you have been following the news, you know that on the last Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, April 24th, President Biden officially recognized the Armenian genocide. And I think that's an important step. I want to point your attention to the article link. It should, I believe it is available on the PDF for you to click. I don't think that we necessarily need to go into it now, but it's an op-ed about why it's an important deal, why this is an important event. And it talks a little bit about it from an Armenian point of view. And I want to suggest that this is a way in which, even if you aren't a history teacher and you want to try to address the Armenian genocide through another disciplinary lens, maybe we can talk about denial and the way that denial works in terms of historical processes. We might be able to use this in our classroom, talking about propaganda, claims, examination, and evidence. Maybe we could use this for inquiry. I don't want to take up too much time, and I do know that we do have time later on, but I want to ask you to take a moment as we're getting ready to move on to inquiry-based learning and just think about how you might be able to bring in the basic information about the Armenian genocide and the 10 steps of the genocide, the 10 steps of genocide, 10 stages of genocide, how you might be able to bring that into your classroom. High school history teachers, I got you covered. 10th grade, easy. I mean, that's modern world. It's right in there. It's 10.4, 10.5. For US history or for civics and government, again, it's maybe a little bit more of a stretch, but you cover World War II in US history and you cover operations of international law and government. So you might be able to come at it from that point of view. But if we have anybody from a different discipline, that might be interesting to find out how people are going to be using it. And with that, I am going to move on and give you guys a few minutes before we begin inquiry-based learning. And Carrie, whenever people have had enough time to maybe put something in chat, we can go ahead and move on to you. And then I'll look really quickly because I've been ignoring chat. Are there any questions? Okay, well, if there are any, we can certainly take them in chat. Thank you very much. And Carrie?
Thank you, Wasim. Yeah, so I want to make sure that we do provide enough wait time. So feel free, if you are a lot slower in the chat, if you want to unmute and just bring up any noticings or any concerns or any questions or thoughts that you had about what Wasim just presented, feel free to unmute. I'll give a few moments for that. Brooke asked if the PowerPoint is linked and if you have access to it. Justin, I don't know if you put that in the chat box, but you will have access to the slide deck where you'll also have access to any links that we have in there. And there he goes. He just put it in the chat box for everyone. Those are our presentation slides. So we're going to move on to inquiry-based learning. And what you see on this slide here, Audrey, when she first introduced us, quickly went over the 4 shifts in the history framework. And 4 years ago or I think it was 3 years ago when we started with the CLIC project, this was something that we followed. And so what I want to focus on is specifically the inquiry and disciplinary thinking, and how might we use that shift when we introduce topics such as the Armenian genocide in the classroom. So what you see on the right-hand side column of that graphic is what you should be looking for when you want to provide an inquiry-based learning session in your class. So what you're wanting to make sure your students do as they're looking at resources and sources is they're going to be able to develop questions and plan inquiries based on those questions and supporting questions that they'll jot down. And then from there, they're going to learn how to apply disciplinary concepts and tools to build more background knowledge, which is something that you want them to be able to do without you spoon feeding them with lectures. Third, we want our students to be evaluating resources, embedding these resources, and using that evidence to what we will want them to eventually do as part of the assessment is to communicate those conclusions. So what did they get from this topic, like the Armenian genocide? And what informed action are they going to be putting in place? So with that, I'm going to show you a list of possible inquiry type questions, because when you're first teaching this concept, if you haven't already implemented it in your classroom with your students, you may need to start off with an inquiry-based question. And then from there, as they're looking at resources, they're able to provide additional questions. But what you'll see on this next slide are just some starter questions that we'd like you to look at. So there are 5 right here. I'm going to give you about a minute to just look at those questions, because I'm going to have you do some deeper dives into some resources we're about to give you. So hopefully you picked one of those questions to be the focus of what you're going to be doing next. And so you are going to begin the inquiry-based learning process just as if you were a student, or you can have your teacher hat on at the same time and kind of, switch back and forth between the two, so that you're thinking about, how might I introduce this in the class? What might I say to my students as a teacher? Or when you have your student hat on, what might I be doing as I'm looking through these resources? So what you'll see next, for those of you that have the opened slide deck, and if you have not yet opened it, we do want you to click on that link that's in the chat box, and I'll have Justin put that in the chat box again, just in case you're scrolling up and down and you don't find it. But we're going to give you 10 minutes of independent time. And in that 10 minutes time, we're going to ask you to click on one or more of these links here. And then you're going to add your thoughts and your thinking on the shared Jamboard. But before I give you that 10 minutes and start, I want to go over real quick what you will find in these resources here. That way, with 10 minutes, and as fast as 10 minutes go, you might want to pick and choose what you see. So the first one, where we're talking about, whoops, I gotta get it on the Armenians in the history of the Armenian genocide. If you click on that link there, it's going to take you to a website, and it's going to give you more information about the Genocide Education Project. But there's also going to be additional links to websites, documents, maps, survivor accounts, which I know when I was a student, if I didn't hear from survivors, I wasn't interested in anything. I needed to be in the nitty gritty. I needed to be in that moment with them. The second link is going to take you to a text set that was created by Liz Ramos. And this text set is really great to look at, and you'll see it right there on your screen. Additional links, and you'll notice in the middle there, it's already got the theme of resistance and remembrance with race and genocide. And as Justin is scrolling down on the bottom, you'll even see what the expectation is for students at the end of looking at these resources, is they are going to select one of these topics and create a memorial or a monument. So even if you don't do that particular lesson, using this text set will be really beneficial in bringing that inquiry-based learning into your classroom. The third bulleted point is the genocideeducation.org website. And within that website, we've linked two additional links. One is a YouTube about the Armenian genocide. And then another is a Facebook page. That way, if you wanted to look at additional linked videos, comments, and what's going on within that community, you can go ahead and take a look at that. So we're going to start the 10-minute timer, and we'd just like you to click on one of those links that you find to be the most interesting, something that you may bring into your classroom. And then about 1 minute before that 10 minutes is up, I'm just going to remind you that we have a minute left, and we'll ask you to click on the Jamboard link that you see on the bottom. And that's going to take you to a digital board where you can share your thoughts. So are there any questions before we start the timer? And feel free to unmute, especially if it's a lot faster than typing in the chat box. Okay, so we're going to give you that 10 minutes to take a deeper dive into additional resources to help you with bringing in the Armenian genocide into your classroom. Okay, and if you did not get a chance to write down a thought or a question or a noticing, go ahead and click on that Jamboard link and take a look at what we have on the board so far. We have one, like in the text set, so many different options. It's like a choice board. So giving these to students and allowing them to choose what they focus on with the Armenian genocide will really foster great discussion in the classroom, as well as having that inquiry-based lesson really take flight. Is there anybody that wants to unmute and share their thought or thoughts? Someone also typed they like the posters on the Genocide Education Project site. Sometimes all it takes is just an image to project on the screen, and you get your students talking about what they notice, what they wonder, what questions they still have. And that starts the inquiry-based learning, helping to build the background. That goes with also the slideshow that somebody wrote about, the slideshow with all the images, just going through that as a whole class before maybe putting kids in groups. So I'll leave this up here for another minute. And if you'd like to unmute and share yours or share something further, we're going to go ahead and do that before I hand this over to Justin, who will have a little bit more information on some offerings. But again, we're going to leave this up for another minute for you to read through, add, or even unmute and give your wonderings and your thinking.
I just want to say that I appreciate this so much because I'm just starting the genocide, and I was mentioning several of the events that you were talking about in your presentation today. And I usually do a longer lesson on the Armenian genocide, and I can't remember the name of it. I'll have to find it and try to share it with you, but it was a museum exhibit of pictures of hands.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you guys know which one I'm talking about, but I used that for years because it profiled survivors, and it took pictures of their hands and their faces, and when they were older, obviously, and then had the kids make an inference about how old they think that they were, and why they would remember the details of their experiences so vividly. And so this is one of the most difficult units to teach, parts of the units, but it is so important. And so I just want to say thank you guys for sharing. And I love that Politico I'm the one that wrote about the political article because making modern connections about why this is important as we move forward for our students, creating that relevancy for them is really, really important. So I just want to say thank you guys for sharing all of those wonderful resources for me. And I will be using it tomorrow in my distance learning class.
Oh, that's great.
I don't know exactly how, but Justin knows I'm a fly by the seat of my pants kind of lady. And I've got tonight, I'll be thinking about how to pull things together and what resources, and I've already been sharing with my future department chair. We're getting a new department chair next year. So I was sharing with him as well as you were sharing with us. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Just hearing you say how you would have usually continued with the your genocide unit, and like just those pictures of the hands and having the kids think about the stories that those hands tell. I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to be there when you do that lesson.
Well, Wasim, I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was a project that was done.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it so I can get the link.
Yeah,
I know what you're talking about.
I'm the queen of Google, so I Googled it years ago and found it, and every year I, have a hard copy, so it's pictures. And I haven't. That's one lesson I did not digitize this year, and unfortunately, because of our limited time and our schedule changes, I did not go over very much. But today was a great reminder that hey, I need to slow down. This is really important, and this is why.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Justin, who's going to be sharing additional information, which for some of you, because it's so close by with the Mariposa Museum, this will be something really cool for you. And then before he goes on, I do want to let you know, in the slide deck, you will see all of our names and emails. So feel free to reach out to us and share what you have, or share what you will be doing with these resources with your class, so that we can hear how that worked out with you and your kids, and just the learning process of it all with your students. So with that, Justin, we're going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Carrie. And I actually wanted to point out, Natalie put a link. Is that it, Emily? Is that the photo set? We're stronger together. We're all Googling together to find it.
I know, and I found it too, so we can
Okay.
compare, but it's the eyewitness, so I'm pretty sure it's from the Genocide Project as well. So
Okay.
that is the downloadable one. Very powerful.
Perfect.
And
Well,
I actually say that that lesson challenges my students more than almost any lesson, because they have to make inference about how old they are now and how old they were, that kind of thing. So
Great. Awesome. Well, I'm excited to dig into that. So in our last few minutes together, I wanted to share a few reminders about how we share our resources here in our Region 7 CLIC, and announcements as well. Carrie had mentioned that one of our CLIC partners, if you were able to join us in January, we had 9 regional partners, historical organizations, civic organizations present, and one of them, the Mariposa Museum and Historical Center, wanted to get some feedback from teachers as far as how they can meet your needs. So in the slide deck, if you have some time, there's a survey access link that you can go into. There's some information there and a short survey that I know they would really appreciate getting feedback, because they want to be responsive to your needs. Also, if you're familiar with us, I'm kind of sad this is our last time we're going to be able to do this, but we always raffle out prizes. So because you stuck with us, there's 5 of you here, so I'm going to shuffle it. Here's what I'm going to raffle out. So we just got new swag as our grant is ending, but we got new swag. So we have these new CLIC mugs. So we're raffling this out with decals with the CLIC logo. So you can put it on your classrooms, computers, wherever, to advertise the framework, the CLIC project. Okay. So that's what we're raffling off. So here we go. I'm going to spin the wheel of names. So the winner is it going to go? Natalie, congratulations. So we're going to mail you your mug and a decal. So if you can email or send me through private chat your mailing address, we will mail that out. And surprise everybody. So my awesome mail support staff here, since there's just 5 of us, everybody gets a mug, everybody gets a decal. I feel like Oprah. So you get a mug, you get a decal.
Yes.
So that's for joining our last session. So everybody send me your mailing address by email or private chat, and we will send this to you. So thank you, Amy, for mailing that out to everybody. And lastly, okay, I got 2 minutes. This is good. So I'm going to add in the chat a survey form that we would really appreciate if you could complete for us. This is how we are able to ensure that we were able to meet your needs this year. Again, this is our last session, but this is data that we will look at statewide, and hopefully we can continue implementation of the framework in some capacity in the future, even though this grant will be ending. Also, I wanted to share this bit.ly folder. I put it in the chat box before, but this is where we're putting a lot of the resources. So I want us to take a look at this Google Drive folder. You can see all of our 9 sessions for the year. All of our session recordings are accessible here as well. One thing I wanted to highlight is this professional development flyers folder, because there's a lot of great PD coming up in our region. So one of them specifically is on the Genocide Education Project. So Sarah Cohen, who is the lead of the Genocide Education Project, they have another virtual session happening in Region 1. It's on May 19th. And so Sarah is going to facilitate a session on resources for genocide education, but for Native American history. So Region 1 CLIC is actually facilitating that. So the flyer is in there. A lot of additional PD is in there, so I encourage all of you to dig in there when you have time. And lastly, just a thank you for being part of this CLIC project, whether you are part of this project from year 1 or if this is your first session. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you will continue to stay engaged with us. Email us at any time. We would love to continue hearing from you and supporting you, because the history framework is a wonderful resource. It's changed how I teach social studies. I love it, and we're better together. And we would love to stay in conversation as a community of practice to support implementation of the framework. So with that, I am just 1 minute over. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I want to thank everybody for joining, and the CLIC team will stay on if you have any questions, if you'd like to chat. But otherwise, we appreciate you taking your time to be with us, and have a great rest of the year.